Hi, welcome to the Week 6 Forum. This last week of Unit 1, we're covering the Progressive Era, which is an immensely important period in the evolution of American federalism. To me, when you're reading this chapter, the important issues relate to the rise of industrialization. How did the emergence of railroads, shipping, and manufacturing alter the basic fabric of the United States, and how those dramatic economic changes reverberate through those parts of the United States that were undergoing those dramatic changes. We have to understand that industrialization didn't sweep through the entire country, but was rather a distinct phenomenon in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and in the West, and really didn't meaningfully penetrate the states of the former Confederacy until well into the 20th century. Um, I love the opening vignette of this chapter. We all know about the role of progressives in pushing through prohibition, but the parallel movement to ban marijuana really uncovers the racism that often was deeply embedded in white middle class America, and not just in the Deep South. That so much of the anti-marijuana campaign relied on lurid and unsubstantiated pseudoscience of the physical effects of marijuana consumption really illustrated the extent to which the progressives were often responding, to things other than hard, actual scientific studies. So while the progressives often believed in science, their beliefs were often kind of selective. Um, that we are only now revisiting this issue is, in my opinion, once again, an important illustration of path dependence. In another sense, the progressive era provides a powerful illustration of what happens when enough people believe in the efficacy of silver bullet solutions. Is domestic abuse a societal problem? We know it is, and it remains an intractable challenge. Progressive era reformers were convinced that alcoholism was sort of the principal cause of wife beating and child abuse, and that banning alcohol would eliminate the problem. What are some of the problems with the progressive era analysis of issues, that are really complex? As I noted in the weekly overview, the reformers of the progressive era believed that governments, either state or federal, were the appropriate institutions for making the kinds of reforms that they believed were needed at the time. We should always give thought to the progressive era amendments to the Constitution, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. Think about these constitutional changes, that were accomplished. Which of these amendments, ratified in a 7-year period between 1913 and 1920, most changed American politics? Here's my opinion, and it's just my opinion. As much as moving the vote to, for senators to statewide elections, and as important as granting women the right to vote, the 16th Amendment fundamentally changed how American government works, not just federalism, but just the whole apparatus of government. The ability of the federal government to extract revenue in the form of income tax was one of the most thoroughgoing alterations of our constitutional regime since the ratification of the Bill of Rights. And I would ultimately rank the 14th and 16th Amendments as 1A and 1B in the most important amendments for impacting the subsequent operation of American government. With the 14th Amendment, the federal government gains the authority to regulate the discriminatory actions of states. But without the 16th Amendment, the federal government would have lacked the revenue capacity to enact national reforms. Now think about it. Would we have survived the Great Depression without the federal government's enhanced taxing authorities? Would we have been able to successfully prosecute World War II without extraordinary fiscal efforts on the part of the federal government? How might the Cold War have turned out if the federal government had lacked the resources? So let's move back to the progressive era broadly considered. One of the things I touch on when I when I teach my media and politics class is the parallel emergence in the progressive era of journalism as a profession, and the consolidation of the print media in that period as a powerful intermediary institution, the fourth branch of government, if you will. How many of the biases that people see in American journalism today are written into its origin story? To what extent were the professional norms of journalism influenced by the progressive era? Path dependence, anyone? Another important issue in analyzing this chapter is that, yes, Progressive era reformers centralized the power of the federal government. But they also greatly strengthened state institutions as well. One of the reasons that state governments had remained so moribund is what Margaret Ware described as the problem of rural bias. State legislative districts, federal as well, were deliberately gerrymandered to maximize rural counties' voting strength and to eliminate the voting strength of growing urban areas. This remained a problem that wasn't resolved until the early 1960s and probably contributed to some of the more significant failures of the progressive era reformers. I really like Robertson's discussions of the challenges that federalism presented to organized labor in terms of gaining a durable political voice in American politics. Robertson argues that federalism was an effective obstacle to labor developing as a political, set of interests. Think about how federalism divides labor, and then think about, how other countries treat labor. Now contrast the relative success that women's rights advocates had in winning ratification in the 19th century. How did they succeed, or ratification of the 19th Amendment? How did they succeed? First, it didn't happen overnight, right? It began at the state level, and then they exploited their successes in various states to build a broad coalition to win ratification of the 19th Amendment. And they were pretty ruthless and pragmatic in how they pursued their ends. How did they overcome the natural intransigence of the southern states, whose political elites would naturally have been resistant to any alterations of the status quo? I find Theda Skocpol's concept of a maternalist welfare state really effective in capturing both the reformist spirit and the underlying biases that informed the progressive era reformers. That women's rights in this period is protecting the weaker sex as opposed to empowering women as political equals might be jarring, but again, it illustrates, that the world that existed at that time and the forces that the reformers were contending with, as well, of course, as their own biases. An important contrast Robertson draws is in evaluating the influence of the progressive era was the success of the prohibitionist movement versus the failure of progressive reformers to ban child labor. How were the prohibitionists able to overcome federalism to impose a nationwide ban on the manufacture and sale of alcohol, while failing ultimately in their efforts to stop the exploitation of children? And again, this suggests that yes, federalism is great in some ways, but it's also horrific. That children were continued to be put to labor, forced labor in horrific circumstances for decades longer. I think there is a lot more to talk about this week. I find this period endlessly fascinating, and I hope the class does as well. What aspect of this chapter really leaps off the page for you? What aspect of this chapter do you find really difficult to understand? Let me know about it, and we'll try to talk it out, and hopefully I can clarify it. Let's have a great week.